There was a male bride who lied about her age, because she was afraid no one would want her. And then, in a snowy western town, a man who had lost everything looked the truth in the face and didn't look away. But what happens when the past she's tried so hard to bury suddenly returns, just when she thought she'd found a place to start over? If faced with the heartbreaking choice Clara made, would you run, or would you stay and face yourself? Have you ever had to hide a part of yourself, just because you were afraid of disappointing others? Have you ever wished someone would tell you that your mistakes don't define who you are? This story is not just about love. It is about a broken heart learning to open up again. If you have had those same long nights, join me on the healing journey Clara found. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to follow this emotional story in its entirety. The grinding of the iron wheels on the rails echoed in a long, steady rhythm, as if dragging the gloomy sky above the endless prairie. The train from St. Louis to the west continued toward the fading sun, leaving behind a faint trail of dust in the wind. The windows of the mid-class car shook slightly with each jolt of the train, and in the seat at the very back of the car, a young girl sat huddled, clutching a small canvas bag tightly to her lap. Clara Mae Dawson clasped her cold hands together, though there was no wind in the train. She looked down at the old letter, its frayed edges and the folds about to tear. It had been read so many times that the handwriting had faded a little, but every time she looked at it, her heart fluttered as if it were the first time she had received it. In the letter, she signed Clara Dawson, 27 years old, but in fact, she was only 20. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Just get there. Just start over. Everything will be okay. She told herself this 100 times over the course of nearly 2,000 miles. Outside the window, the sky gradually turned to a bronze color. The distinctive smell of dry earth of the Wild West penetrated through the cracks of the window, mingling with the chill of late autumn. In the distance, the mountain ranges appeared hazy in the afternoon light. The scene was beautiful and lonely, strong but silent, just like Clara's life in the months after the incident. An elderly woman sitting opposite spoke up, her voice hoarse but warm. "The little girl has gone far, hasn't she?" Clara started slightly, smiling politely. Yes. I'm getting off at Dry Creek." The woman looked at her for a long moment, then smiled understandingly. "You are a mail-order bride." "Right." Clara clenched the letter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The truth, though she did not say it aloud, was evident in the anxious eyes of a young woman leaving her homeland. "Yes, I am." Her voice was small, as if afraid someone would hear. The woman smiled gently. "There's nothing to be ashamed of. I was a mail-order bride 30 years ago. I went to Colorado, alone. I was scared to death. But it worked out. Sometimes you have to go far away to find what you need." That statement touched a place in Clara's heart, the place where she tried to hide her vulnerability. She glanced back at the letter. It was written in the sturdy style of a man who had seen more years than she could ever imagine. A widowed cowboy named Elias Holt, owner of a 100-acre ranch in Wyoming. A quiet, matter-of-fact man. And, as he wrote, not looking for romantic fantasies. He wanted a woman mature enough to understand how tough life is in the West. He wanted someone strong enough to support him in caring for his ranch and his vulnerable son. He wanted someone 27. And she was only 20, an age just in time to touch the first losses of life. 7 years too long a gap to be explained with a few lines of apology. But if Clara didn't do it, her sister would be left without someone to care for her. The family had been torn apart by a harsh winter and a series of illnesses. In St. Louis, every door had been closed to a young girl without a father, a mother, or any money. The train suddenly slowed down, the wheels screeching loudly. A passenger stuck his head out into the hallway and shouted, "Dry Creek Depot." 5 minutes to the last stop, Clara swallowed. Here it was, the place where her old life ended, and a new one of unknown shape, her form, awaited. The train car shuddered one last time before slowly coming to a stop. When the doors opened, a cold wind from the step blew into her face, carrying with it the smell of cracked earth and pine resin. Clara stepped onto the tiny wooden platform, her legs shaking slightly. Dry Creek was a desolate station. with a few sparse wooden houses and flickering oil lamps. The moment her feet touched the ground, Clara heard the sound of horse hooves in the distance. She raised her head. A man on horseback approached. His dark leather jacket was covered with road grime, and a wide-brimmed hat hid much of his sunburnt face. He stopped where the station lights dimmed and looked straight at her. That look, deep, heavy. Something like it was old and had been broken and put back together. Clara recognized him immediately. Elias Grant Holt. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. She forced a polite smile. You are Mr. Holt." The man nodded slightly, his voice low. "And you are Miss Dawson." Claire swallowed again. This moment she had been running away from all this long train ride had finally come. Yes. I'm Clara Dawson." Elias's eyes swept over Clara's young face. For a moment, he frowned slightly. But instead of showing disappointment or doubt, he remained silent. The long silence made Clara feel even more suffocated. Then he said, "You are younger than I thought." Clara's heart sank. But he continued, "But such a long way. You still dare to go alone. I respect that." She didn't know how to react, but at least he didn't immediately chase her away. Elias pointed to a wagon parked nearby. "Get in. Holt Creek Ranch is a little over 3 miles away." Clara stepped into the car, her hands shaking slightly. Before the wagon rolled away, she glanced back at the small station where she had left her youth, her hometown, her regrets, and the truth she had yet to have the courage to speak. The train began to move into the western night. The sound of horse hooves mingled with the cold wind whipping through the pine trees, and Clara knew that from now on, her life would never be the same again. A lonely West, a silent cowboy, a secret bigger than she ever thought, and a future that even she herself did not know where it would lead. The wagon rolled slowly away from the station, its wooden wheels creaking on the rocky dirt road. Clara pulled her scarf closer around her neck as the wind from the steppe blew, carrying a sharp chill. In the gradually thickening darkness, only the sound of Elias's horse's hooves and the faint breathing of cattle somewhere in the fields echoed. Clara stared straight ahead, her heart pounding. The silence made her realize all the more how different the world she grew up in was from the one she was now being transported to. In St. Louis, the crowded streets could make her feel lost. But she had never felt so small as she did on the deserted road leading to Holt Creek Ranch. Elias held the reins with one hand and rested the other on his knee, his posture straight and sure. He hadn't said another word since the wagon left the platform. His broad shoulders, dusty from the road, made him seem a part of the land, solid and somewhat distant. The oil lamp hanging in front of the wagon illuminated his square face, highlighting the deep wrinkles that stretched across the corners of his eyes. Clara wanted to speak, but every time she tried, her throat constricted with fear, afraid that she wouldn't know where to begin. She was afraid that she would say something that would make Elias doubt her true age. She was afraid that she would say the wrong thing, that she would disappoint him. She was afraid that she wasn't strong enough to survive in the challenging world he wrote about. After a while, Elias spoke first. "Are you cold?" Clara was a little startled by the voice. Low and calm as a pine in winter. "No, just a little windy." He watched her for a moment. No one said anything, but his eyes saw the slight tremor in her hands. Elias bent down and took the woolen blanket from behind the chair and handed it to Clara. Clara took it, said a soft thank you, and draped it over her slender shoulders. The blanket smelled of the wind from the fields and a faint scent of mint tobacco, a strange scent that made her feel strangely at ease. She looked out into the distance, where the darkness of the horizon seemed to swallow all shapes. The cabins of Dry Creek faded behind them. The road ahead was guided only by the dim light of a small oil lamp. Every jolt of the wagon reminded Clara that she was indeed entering another life. Suddenly, the sound of another horse's hooves rang out from behind. Elias immediately pulled lightly on the reins and turned around. A young man on a black horse was approaching, the sound of hooves pounding on the ground. That person was none other than Jacob Holt, son of Elias. The boy was about 16, his face thin but sharp, his leather jacket and wide-brimmed hat covering most of his eyes, but not hiding the cold and wary look of adolescence. He stopped his horse right next to the wagon without even looking at Clara. "You'll be late. It's getting dark." Jacob's voice was hard and a little reproachful, but there was no hiding his concern. "There's business in town, and this is Miss Dawson. She'll be staying with us for a while," Elias replied, his voice unchanged. Only then did Jacob turn to look at Clara. It wasn't the curious or friendly look she'd expected. It was a look that seemed defensive against a stranger who might disrupt his small world. Clara smiled slightly, hoping to soften the distance. "Hello, Jacob?" He just nodded curtly, saying nothing more. Clara felt the cold wind blow when Jacob appeared, but she understood. A child who had experienced loss did not easily open up to someone, especially someone who could change the family order. The three of them continued to move in silence. The only sounds were the wind and the sound of hooves hitting the ground. Occasionally, Clara saw Elias glance at Jacob, his eyes filled with unspoken thoughts. After a while, a few lamps appeared in the darkness. The rows of wooden fences on both sides of the road appeared in the dim light. Clara looked at them, and her heart skipped a beat. Holt Creek Ranch. The ranch gate was two large, roughly hewn pine trunks, sturdy, with a hand-carved wooden sign above it, the name of the ranch engraved in the deep strokes of a carpenter's knife. As soon as the wagon rolled through the gate, Clara felt like she was entering a new world, a vast and challenging world. Jacob spurred his horse ahead, and Elias slowly drove into the yard. The two-story wooden house appeared in the yellow light. The roof was a dark reddish-brown, and the steps were covered with dry pine needles. Smoke from the stove rose straight into the cold sky. Clara stepped out of the wagon, her scarf slipping slightly as the wind picked up. The ground beneath her feet was hard and dry, a far cry from the damp cobblestone streets where she had lived. Elias held out his hand to her. The road was slippery. "Be careful." Clara placed her hand on his. His was warm, hard, and calloused from years of working on the farm. She felt a small sense of relief spread through her chest. Jacob stood on the steps, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to figure out how the new woman would change the house. Clara followed Elias inside, her heart a mixture of hope and fear. Inside the house was warmer, smelling of pine burning in the fireplace. The walls were painted natural wood, with a few saddles and old coat hooks hanging from them. Clara could hear the history of the house emanating from every grain of the wood. Elias turned, his voice slow and clear. "You can rest for the night. I'll show you around the ranch tomorrow. There's much you need to know before you commit." Clara nodded slightly. "Yes, I thank you for bringing me here." Elias's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, as if trying to read something in her young face, but he didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded and pointed up the stairs. "Her room is upstairs. Jacob, show Miss Dawson the way." Jacob paused, clearly unhappy, but he turned and walked up the stairs. Clara followed. Behind her, she heard Elias add more wood to the fire crackling like staccato notes. Up the hallway, Jacob stopped in front of a wooden door. "Here's your room." His voice was short, cold, and unfriendly. "Thank you, Jacob," Clara replied softly, but he had already turned away. Clara stood in front of the door and took a deep breath. When she pushed the door open, she saw a small room with a single wooden bed and a window overlooking the darkness of the grassland. In that moment, she realized that her journey to find her life again had just begun, a life so strange, so vast, and so scary. But Clara knew, whatever it was, she had to face it, because behind her, there was nothing to turn back to. The first morning at Holt Creek Ranch began before Clara could open her eyes. The rooster crowed from the far coop, and a strong wind swept across the wooden roof, making the slats sigh with the late autumn air. The weak sunlight filtered through the small window onto the thick blanket draped across Clara, and she suddenly realized she was no longer on a long train or at the small station at Dry Creek. She was in Wyoming, at the home of a man she barely knew, and everything from here would be more connected to her life than she had imagined. Clara sat up and touched the rough linen sheets. The room was simple, sparsely furnished but tidy. It lacked the comforts of her former home, but the smell of pine and the still air made her feel strangely at peace. She changed into a simple house dress and put on a warm scarf she had brought from the countryside. As she opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, her feet hit the cold wooden floor, making her shiver slightly. From below came the crackling of wood in the stove and the faint clanking of pots and pans. Clara walked down the stairs, slowly, as if afraid to disturb the morning peace. Halfway up, she saw Elias standing by the stove. His back was to her, his shirt rolled up to his elbows, his broad shoulders blocking most of the light from the back door. He was boiling coffee, and the rich aroma filled the room. Clara hesitated for a moment before speaking. Good morning. Mr. Holt? Elias turned his head slightly. She was up early. One had to get used to it on the ranch. Clara nodded. Yes, I'm used to it. I also got up very early in the countryside. Elias set the iron coffee pot on the table and looked at Clara with a more gentle, searching gaze than last night. She could help herself if she wanted. There wasn't much to eat. Jacob was still out in the stables. Clara walked over to the kitchen counter. The smell of yesterday's cornbread lingered in the air. She hesitated for a moment, then began clearing the dishes, finding a place for them as if they were her own doing. Elias watched her work without saying anything, but Clara felt his gaze. It was a gaze that was both observant and calculating and distant. Clara asked softly, "What can I do to help you in the morning?" Elias sipped his coffee, his voice quiet. "You take care of the house first. The ranch. I'll show you later." Clara nodded. "Yes, I understand." The door opened behind him. Jacob entered, his shoes covered in dirt. His eyes swept over Clara, as cold as the night before, but he said nothing. Elias watched his son and continued, "Jacob, if you're done with breakfast, show Miss Dawson around the main house. Let her know where the barn, woodshed, and water area are." Jacob put his cowboy hat on the table and replied curtly, "Yes, Father." Clara saw the reluctance in his eyes, but didn't say anything. She just smiled slightly. "Good morning, Jacob." He nodded, but his face remained stony. After breakfast, Clara walked out into the yard with Jacob. The sun was higher, reflecting off the waters of Holt Creek that wound through the back of the house. Long fences led from the stables to a large pasture where a few cows grazed. Beyond was Silver Ridge Mountain, a steep mountainside that protected the land like a natural wall. Clara took a deep breath. The scenery was beautiful, yet also overwhelmingly desolate. Jacob walked ahead, not looking at her as he pointed to each area. That was the water tank. Over there was the tool shed, and in the back was the firewood storage. Winters here were cold, so we had to prepare early. Clara remembered every word. "You lived here since you were little." Jacob simply replied, "Yes." There was a long silence. Clara wanted to say something more to make him less distant, but she didn't know if her words would make things worse. She felt like he was a small animal, wounded and always wary of anything that touched his world. As they passed the stables, Clara stopped. A sorrel stallion stood close to the fence, its large black eyes sparkling in the morning sun. Clara gently reached out to touch its warm fur. The horse nuzzled her hand, unflinching. Clara smiled genuinely. It was beautiful. Jacob glanced at her and spoke in a lower voice than usual. "Her name was Maple. My mother used to ride her." His voice dropped, like a small stone placed on Clara's heart. She couldn't say anything but a soft word. "I'm sorry." Jacob tightened his grip on the reins. "It was okay." But Clara knows, for a boy who lost his mother, every memory, no matter how small, is a wound that has never fully healed. When they returned to the main house, Elias stood on the steps, watching from a distance. He didn't come close, but his eyes followed Clara's every move, as if assessing her to see if she would fit in. Clara could sense it, and for some reason, she felt like she wanted to do well, to prove that she hadn't come here just to find shelter. She wanted to be worthy of the opportunity life had given her, even if it was built on a lie she hadn't yet had the courage to confess. That afternoon, as Clara stood in the kitchen preparing lunch with a few simple ingredients, the wind from the window blew the curtains slightly. She looked out at the wide prairie, where the golden light poured in endless streams. Suddenly, she felt her heart soften. Maybe this place would be the starting point of her new life. Maybe she would find what she had lost all these years. But maybe the secret of her true age would sweep everything away when exposed. Whatever the case, Clara understood that Holt Creek Ranch was more than just a piece of land. It was a challenge, a test of courage, and a place where her heart began to move in unexpected ways. In the days that followed, Clara gradually became accustomed to the rhythm of life at Holt Creek Ranch. Mornings began before the sun rose. The cool air covered the lawn in a thin layer of dew, and behind the house, the gentle flow of Holt Creek made a lullaby. Clara would stand in front of the kitchen door for a few minutes, take a deep breath, and feel the quiet of the West. Before she began her work, she lit the stove, prepared breakfast, and made coffee the way Elias liked it strong, with little sugar and a little bitter. Jacob remained wary, but he no longer seemed as annoyed as he had been the first few days. Perhaps because Clara was gentle and didn't force him to talk to her. One morning, after breakfast, Elias put his cup of coffee down on the table and looked out the window. The early morning sunlight highlighted the calluses on his hands. "Come with me to the back garden today. We need to replant some vegetables before it gets cold." Clara nodded slightly. "Yes, I'm ready." Elias handed her a pair of gardening gloves that were a little worn, but still sturdy. As they stepped out into the back, the early morning breeze blew gently through the trees, rustling the last leaves of the season. The small garden lay beside the creek, the soil dry from the long summer but still moist enough to be hopeful. Elias stuck the shovel into the ground, his voice even and slow. Wyoming soil is not easy to tame. It takes time and patience, like people. Clara turned to look at him, a smile reflecting in her eyes. "I think anything can change if you care long enough." Elias did not reply, but his expression softened a little. They worked in silence all morning, but it wasn't a heavy silence. Elias's movements were slow and sure, and Clara tried to imitate the way he used the shovel, the way he tested the looseness of the soil. Sometimes she felt as if he were teaching her, little by little, the ways of life in the harsh West. As Clara buried the seeds in the furrows, she thought to herself. She wondered if she was planting new seeds of hope here, if she were starting a life she could truly belong to. At noon, they rested under the shade of an old maple tree. Elias poured her some water from an iron jug, and the breeze carried the smell of sap and freshly plowed earth. Clara asked softly, "Have you lived here long?" "Since I was a child. Holt Creek Ranch was all my father left me. I kept it for the family." She was silent for a moment before continuing. "This place seems important to you." "Yeah. And sometimes it gets lonely to the point of being uncomfortable, but leaving is never an option." Clara heard a heaviness in his voice that was hard for outsiders to detect. A man like Elias did not easily express his emotions, but occasionally it would show through a few short sentences. That afternoon, Clara tried horseback riding for the first time. Elias chose Maple, the gentlest horse in the stable. Jacob led Maple out to the yard, but he just stood there, not taking any action to help Clara. She stood beside the horse, a little nervous. "I've never ridden a horse before." "I hope I'm not bothering Maple," Jacob replied in a low voice. Less sharp than the first few days, he was more patient than most. Elias held out his hand for Clara to hold on to and pointed to where to put her feet. "Go slowly. Don't try to control her too much." Horses sense their rider's fear. Clara mounted the saddle, her hands shaking slightly, but as Maple took the first few steps, its smoothness and steady rhythm made her relax. The wind in her hair, the sun warming her shoulders, made her feel free in a very different way. Elias walked beside her, his hand on the other rein. "Well done. Miss Dawson, you're a quicker learner than I thought." Clara chuckled softly, a sound that made Jacob turn his head to look at her for a moment before looking away again. "I'm trying." The riding session ended as the sky began to cast long shadows across the fields. As Maple led Clara closer to the last corral, she suddenly felt a little less alienated. Though there were still many uncertainties, she found a sense of peace creeping into her heart. In the evening, as Clara prepared dinner in the kitchen, Elias walked in, placing his cowboy hat on the table. "I wanted to say, thanks for today. My backyard has been neglected for a long time. It's hard to do it alone." Clara turned back, still slicing potatoes. "I'm glad I could help. This place makes me feel better, more peaceful." Elias watched her for a long time. The West was not always peaceful. But if she listened to it, she would understand more. Something in his voice warmed Clara's chest. A small but real feeling was beginning to sprout inside her, like the seeds in her backyard. When she brought dinner to the table, Jacob looked from the plate to her, his eyes less hostile. Dinner smelled good. Clara smiled and said nothing more, but that small remark made her unexpectedly happy. At night, Clara stood at her window, watching the moonlight reflect off the waters of Holt Creek. The chirping of insects, the wind whistling through the fence, and the smell of wood from the chimney downstairs blended into a strange silence. She folded her arms across her chest, thinking about today. No one asked her about her age. No one suspected. Even if it was just a little bit, she had taken another step into life here. But at the same time, the worry about that secret still lay just beneath this new layer of peace. It was like a small crack in the solid rock, just waiting for an impact to spread. Clara knew the day would come when she would have to tell the truth. She just didn't know when. And when that time came, whether what she had sown today would be strong enough to keep her at Holt Creek Ranch. The following days passed with the steady rhythm of life at Holt Creek Ranch. But inside Clara, things were not as quiet as they seemed. The more she got used to the work, the more she learned about the people here, the more her unspoken thoughts stirred. The secret of her age was like a thorn in her flesh, unseen, but never really gone. One late autumn afternoon, the wind was blowing harder than usual. Gray clouds were gathering on the horizon, signaling a small storm might soon arrive. Clara was gathering some blankets to dry on the porch when Elias emerged from the stable. He brushed the dust off his leather jacket and looked at the sky with a practiced gaze. The creek rose earlier than usual today. Had to tie off some of the fence to prevent it from washing over. Could you help with the house preparations? Clara nodded. Yes, I'll take care of the house. Call me if you need anything. Elias stood still for a moment, then spoke slowly. Don't worry. This region is used to strong winds like that, but it's better to be prepared. It was that deep voice, the way he put everyone's safety first, that made Clara's heart soften in an inexplicable way. Throughout the afternoon, she rearranged the shelves, checked the oil lamps, and gathered wood for the stove. Jacob stood on the porch, watching the wind and glancing occasionally into the house. Though he didn't speak, Clara sensed his quiet concern, a dry concern, like his father's. As dusk fell, the sun was a pale red glow behind a blanket of gray clouds. Winds swept across the fields, carrying the smell of dry earth and cold water. Elias returned home in the twilight, his coat streaked with mud. He walked in, brushed himself off, and hung his coat on the hook by the door. The fence was fine, but creek was coming up fast. It would be noisy tonight. Claire put the kettle on the counter. She could make some hot tea. Hopefully it would help everyone sleep better. Elias nodded slightly. Thank you. Hearing those two words, Clara felt her heart tremble slightly. His kindness was always so simple that it caught people off guard. That night, the creek murmured louder than usual. Clara lay in her room, eyes open, listening to the wind blowing against the window. The sounds reminded her of the uncertainty of life in the Wild West. No one knew what was coming, and no one could live with a lie for long. She turned, looking up at the dark patch of ceiling. It has to be said, Clara thought. This secret can't be kept forever. But fear wrapped around her like a cold blanket. What if he is disappointed? What if Jacob loses faith? What if she lost the last home she could call home? Clara closed her eyes and let out a small sigh. In her heart, the desire for honesty and the fear of rejection tugged at each other, neither willing to give in. The next morning the sun reappeared after a night wind. The air was as clear as a wash. Holt Creek still flowed strong, but calmer. Clara took the laundry out to the drying yard and found Elias going over some tools by the stables. She wanted to say something, but her throat felt tight. Elias saw her and nodded slightly. Creek wet some of the ground, but that's okay. On a windy night, Creek doesn't claim more of his land. He spoke in a half-joking tone. Clara chuckled, the sound echoing a little in the cold morning. Elias put his things down, crossed his arms, and looked at her for a long time. Can you sleep? Clara shook her head slightly. Not much, but enough. I'm getting used to it. He looked at her for another second. If there's anything wrong, you can tell me. The statement was so simple, but it was that simplicity that confused Clara. She replied in a small voice, Yes, I know. But she could say nothing more. In the afternoon, Elias left the ranch to take some loads into the town of Ash Ridge. Jacob followed him for a while, then returned to help Clara harvest the greens that had survived the wind. The two worked side by side in silence, but not as tense as the first few days. Jacob bent down and picked up some unbroken basil. Clara, you know, my father doesn't trust people easily, but I see he's starting to trust you. Clara paused. Really, Jacob looked up, his eyes no longer cold. If he didn't believe her, he wouldn't have let her help with important household chores. Those words made Clara's hands tremble slightly. A warmth spread in her chest. Trust. That was what she feared she would lose if the truth were exposed. The sky was getting dark. By the time they finished harvesting, Elias had returned. He pulled up in his wagon and put down some bags of flour and some new supplies. Clara stepped out to help him. Are you tired? Elias brushed the dust off his trousers and smiled in a rare way. It's been a long ride, but not too bad. I have something to show you. He opened a small bag and took out a sturdy old leather-bound notebook. It was my mother's notebook. She used it to track the crops and record her own experiences. I thought you might want it. Clara took the book, her hand shaking slightly. Why would you give me something so precious? Elias looked at the golden grass in the evening light and spoke slowly. Because I can see you are trying. This land needs people with patience. You have that. Clara's heart clenched. You believe me? I feel I must. But the words stuck in my throat. Elias looked at her, his eyes calm and sincere. There was no rush. She would speak when she felt ready. Clara bowed her head, hot tears welling up in her eyes, for reasons she didn't know. Perhaps it was because the old man's kindness was so great that it made her want to melt on the spot. That evening, as she spread the leather-bound book on the table, Elias' mother's soft handwriting appeared under the oil lamplight. The notes were simple, but full of love for this land. A small door opened in Clara's heart. She knew that soon. She would have to choose either speak out or live forever in fear of losing this place. And for the first time since arriving at Holt Creek Ranch, she felt like she wanted to choose the truth. Not out of obligation, but because this place is slowly becoming home. The next morning, a mist covered every blade of grass around Holt Creek Ranch. Clara opened the door and stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply, feeling the coolness seep into her chest. Her morning routine was now familiar. She made coffee for Elias, prepared some pastries, and cleaned the kitchen. Still, her heart was heavy with unsaid words. Elias came in from checking on the cattle in the north. His shirt was a little dusty. He took the cup of coffee from Clara and stood by the window, looking out at the fields, which were slowly turning golden in the sun. What are you thinking about? Standing so silent. Miss Dawson. Clara started slightly. No. I was just thinking about the backyard. I hope the seeds I planted yesterday will grow. Elias looked at her for a second and nodded. If the soil would accept them, they would grow. But the weather was getting colder, so they would have to be more careful. His voice was low, but there was a confidence in it that Clara felt she did not deserve. It was that confidence that made her even more confused. After breakfast, Jacob went out to check the west fence as his father had asked. Clara stayed behind to clean up. As she was washing the last dishes, there was a sudden knock on the door. She wiped her hands and went to open the door. Standing in the doorway was a middle-aged woman, with a sturdy figure typical of the West, her hair tied back in a bun. Her face was bright, but her eyes were so sharp that it made anyone feel like they could see through her. Are you Elias' new bride? Clara was a little taken aback by the frankness. Yes, I'm Clara. The woman nodded. I'm Martha Thompson. I live near the road into town. I stopped by to pick up some eggs and a few other things for Elias. Clara invited her in. Martha looked Clara up and down with a look that wasn't exactly unpleasant, but enough to make Clara stand up straighter. I hear there's a girl from the East who's come here for a letter marriage. Elias isn't one to take anyone in his life lightly. Clara bowed her head slightly. I know, and I'm trying my best. Martha put the basket down on the table, her eyes lingering on Clara for a moment longer. She was still young. This was a tough place, and she had to be stronger than anyone. Clara's heart skipped a beat at that, not because of the seriousness in her tone, but because it felt like she was testing Clara to see if she had the courage to stay at Holt Creek Ranch. Clara smiled slightly. "I will do my best." Martha looked at her one more time before turning away. "I hope so. Elias deserves someone who is serious, not someone who is running away from something." Clara heard the last sentence like a needle piercing her heart. Martha had no idea, but the words touched her deepest fear. After Martha left, Clara stood by the table for a long time, unconsciously squeezing the edge of her napkin. Everyone in this land lived by truth, honesty, and resilience. And what about her? She came here with a secret. Elias's voice from the back door startled her. "What's wrong? You look pale." Clara turned back, trying to keep her composure. "No, it's nothing. It's just... I met Martha. She brought you a present." Elias frowned slightly, but not in displeasure. Martha was kind but blunt. She didn't mind if her words were a little harsh. Clara shook her head slightly. "I'm fine," but she knew she wasn't quite all right. Perhaps what Martha had said had awakened a fear Clara had been trying to suppress. That afternoon, Elias asked her to help him move some bags of winter seeds into the barn. As she set each bag down, Clara looked at Elias's hands. The thick calluses and prominent veins were like maps of a life that had been burdened. And in that moment, she wondered would he forgive her if he knew she was not the woman he thought she was. Clara placed her hand on the last bag of seeds and spoke in a low voice so only she could hear. "I have to say it." Elias looked up. "What did she just say?" She quickly shook her head. "No, it's just that the dust is making me a little tired." He looked at her a little more and asked no more. As the evening light faded and a cold wind blew in from the mountains, Clara walked to the creek bank. The water was running strong after the wind of the past few days. She stood still, watching the water lapping against the bank. Strong, but honest. Hiding nothing. She whispered, "I have to pick the right time. But when is the right time?" As she was lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Elias approached, his shoes lightly covered in dirt from his work. "Do you like standing here?" Clara nodded. This place made it easier for her to breathe. Elias stood beside her. "Not too close. Not too far. I used to come here too when I wanted some quiet." Clara turned to look at him. "You have a lot to worry about, don't you?" He smiled slightly, a rare smile. Everyone who lived in this part of the world had their worries, but if you kept them to yourself, they would wear you down. Clara listened to each word as if it were sinking into her heart. If one day someone said something that disappointed him, what would he do? Elias stared at the water for a long moment. When he answered, his voice was low but not cold. "I would want the person to tell me the truth. No beating around the bush. No hiding, no matter how unpleasant it was." Clara clenched her hands together. And what if it hurt him? Elias let out a small breath, as if the question had touched a deep memory. Hurt is easier than being lied to, because knowing the truth allows you to choose how to move forward. Lies block everything. They stood still as Creek murmured. Clara felt her feet sink into the ground. Elias had said exactly what she feared, and in that moment, she realized the moment of facing the truth was closer than ever. Clara bowed her head, her voice trembling slightly. "I understand." Elias looked at her, his eyes softening. "Good." Sometimes, speaking up was a way to free oneself. She didn't reply, but inside, an undercurrent was rising. Each word Elias spoke was like a gentle tap on the defenses she had built up over the long months. She knew she was about to face the most important thing since arriving at Holt Creek Ranch. And for the first time, she felt brave enough to do it. It's just, she doesn't know when that day will come. The early winter wind blew across the seemingly endless grasslands before Holt Creek Ranch. The air was chilly, but the sky was bright, the sun shining through like thin threads, weaving a fragile peace into the landscape. Clara wrapped herself in a woolen scarf and stepped out of the door to prepare for her daily chores. The kettle was steaming, and the aroma of coffee wafted from the kitchen. But in Clara's heart, that peace was like a thin, easily torn cloth. The secret still lay silent, but she felt it was beginning to shake, as if a cold wind could touch it at any moment. Jacob returned from the stables with a few tools in hand. He placed them on the table by the porch, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked at Clara. "My dad said we should check the east side today. I hear some of the fence posts there are weak." Clara nodded slightly, replying in a gentle voice, "I will prepare some food to bring." Jacob was silent for a moment before adding, "Clara, you seemed worried about something yesterday. I don't know what's bothering you, but if you need me, I can help." Clara paused. The awkward kindness softened her eyes. "Thank you. I just have a lot on my mind, but it'll be okay." Jacob didn't ask any further. He just nodded briefly and turned away. For a boy living in this harsh land, that was already a form of sincere concern. At noon, Elias prepared to go out to the fields to check the fence. He put on his thick coat and looked at Clara. "Want to come along? No work needed, just to see the ranch." Clara hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "Okay. I'd like to know more." The two of them climbed into the small wagon. Elias held the reins, and the cart rolled over the rough ground, the creaking of wood blending with the wind blowing through the meadow. The road to the eastern district ran through a vast expanse of land. From there, the distant mountains could be seen, dimly lit by the light. Clara sat next to Elias, holding her scarf tight to keep it from blowing away. The air was so fresh that she felt as if she were looking at the world from a different place. Elias said without looking at her, "How are you feeling?" "It's not easy getting used to this place," Clara replied softly. "I feel better. I have a lot of worries, but I know I want to stay." He tilted his head a little, looking surprised. Staying meant facing things, sometimes even yourself. The words hit Clara harder than she expected. She clenched her fists, and the sudden gust of wind caused her scarf to shift a little. Elias held her still, his movements careful and respectful. A warmth spread from that gesture, leaving Clara speechless. The eastern fence appeared from behind a low mound. A few of the posts were bent from the earlier gust. Elias stepped down first, examining each slat, while Clara stood nearby, watching. She noticed that Elias did everything very carefully. No rush, no hurry, but every action was precise, as if he had been doing this all his life and knew exactly what was most important. Clara came closer. "Do you need any help?" Elias shook his head. "No need to bother, but it would be nice if you could hold the rope for me." She took the rope and stood beside him. In that moment, as they both bent over a slanted fence post, the sunlight cast long shadows on the yellow grass. Clara looked at Elias's hands as they tightened the rope, his knuckles clearly visible. A man who had been through so much, a man accustomed to truth, to loss, to standing up in storms. And that's why Clara was even more worried when thinking about her secret. As Elias was tying down a new post, the sound of horse hooves was heard in the distance. A man on horseback approached. When he reached them, he stopped and touched his hat to Elias's. "Hi, Elias. I heard your ranch was battered by the wind, so I stopped by to check it out." Elias stood up. "Hello, Mr. Barnes. We're fine. Just need a little tidying up." The man named Barnes looked at Clara. His gaze was a little scrutinizing, but not impolite. "And this is," Elias replied naturally, "Clara. She helps around the house." Clara bowed. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Barnes." Barnes narrowed his eyes for a moment, as if sizing up the newcomer. "You're from out east far away. You must be strong to come this far," Clara replied softly. "Yes, I'm trying every day." Barnes smiled, but his eyes were a little too sharp. "Just don't bring trouble from the east." That sentence made the air around Clara sink. Although Barnes was only speaking politely, his words seemed to deliberately pierce the place she was hiding. Elias noticed the slight worry that crossed Clara's face. He stood slightly to one side, as if to block the stranger's prying eyes. Barnes made a few more comments about the weather and left. As the sound of hooves faded, Clara's breathing slowed. Elias looked at her. "Are you okay?" Clara forced a smile. "It's fine. Just a little surprised." He was silent for a moment. "People here are blunt, sometimes tactless, but they mean no harm." Clara wasn't sure Barnes meant no harm. The look in his eyes was enough to make her feel as if her secret was on the edge of a cliff. By the time they returned to the ranch, The afternoon was approaching. A thin layer of sunlight spread over the grasslands, just enough yellow to make the landscape look sadly beautiful. Clara followed a few steps behind Elias, the day's words swirling around in her head like a wind that couldn't find its way out. If there is something that disappoints you, if hurt is better than lies, if someone is avoiding something, it all echoed in her mind. Clara felt as if she were on the edge. The slightest movement would be enough to give away her secret. In the evening, as Clara was about to put the teapot down on the table, Elias spoke to her in a rather low voice. "Clara, maybe you should go to bed early. You don't look well." Clara looked up at him. "I'm fine." Elias still looked at her with a strange understanding. All day long she had something to say and then didn't. "I didn't force her, but don't push yourself too hard." She tightened her grip on the teapot handle. "I know," Elias continued, his voice as if speaking to her and no one else. "When you are ready, I will listen." Clara stood still for a few seconds. Her heart felt like it was in a knot. She felt like she was standing before the hardest door of her life. She replied softly, "I will tell. Just not today." Elias nodded slightly. "Not rushing. I could wait." That night, when Clara returned to her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, her hands in her lap. In the dim light from the oil lamp, her face was reflected in the window glass. Looking at herself, she realized her eyes were no longer the same as when she had first arrived at Holt Creek Ranch. Now, there was hesitation, there was fear, but there was something else too, a desire to belong. A desire so deep it made her tremble to think that even the slightest truth could shatter it all. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't back down anymore. The moment to face the truth is very near. There's just one thing she doesn't know. Will the truth destroy her life, or open a new door? That morning, the rooftops around Holt Creek Ranch were covered in a thick blanket of frost. The cold air clung to her every breath, forcing Clara to pull her scarf closer to her neck as she stepped out the door. It was still dark. The sun had not yet broken through the darkness to shine on the grasslands. Only the small light from the kitchen provided a warm spot in the early winter chill. Clara rekindled the fire, listening to the crackle of the wood. The heat grew slowly, but surely, like the sense of security Elias had brought her all these weeks. She tried to keep her mind calm, but inside, worry swirled like an undercurrent. As she set the coffee pot on the table, Elias entered through the back door. His coat was frosted white and his hands were cold. He rubbed them together before sitting down. "It's cold today," he said, his voice hoarse from the morning chill. Clara put the cup of coffee in front of him. "Yes, it seems winter came earlier than last year." Elias took a sip, his eyes looking at Clara as if he was observing and worried about something. Was she okay? She looked like she had trouble sleeping these days. Clara paused for a moment, but tried to hide it. Yes, probably because she wasn't used to the weather yet. Elias nodded slightly, saying nothing more, but his eyes did not entirely believe the answer. In the dim morning light, he looked a little older, but also gentler and more resilient, like a large tree that had stood firm through many storms. Jacob walked in, carrying the smell of wind and hay from the stable. "Dad, the cattle need to be pushed higher today. The dew is thick tonight." Elias stood up and took his coat. "Then let's go. Clara, can you help prepare some food for us to take with us?" Clara nodded. "Yes, sir." The morning passed in such small tasks. Clara prepared bread, dried meat, and a bottle of water for the two of them to take with them. When she handed the bag to Elias, her hand unconsciously brushed against his. A warmth ran down her arm and she flinched, but Elias kept his gaze calm. "Thank you," he said. Not a word was wasted. Not a word was missing. But just that one word of thanks was enough to give Clara strength. Clara spent the rest of the day tending to the house. She chopped wood, polished the wooden furniture, hung a thick blanket on the porch to dry. Each movement was slow and measured, as if trying to steady her heartbeat against the storm of emotions that was approaching. As the afternoon sun began to set, Elias and Jacob returned. They brought with them the smell of earth, the wind, and a lingering weariness. Elias placed his hat on the table and sighed. "Pretty good. The cows are up on the hill. But you know, every time the seasons change, I miss my mother more." Clara stopped preparing dinner. Why, Elias mused. She always said that winter was not as scary as loneliness. She died when I was young, but her words still follow me. Clara was silent for a moment. It sounded like what she said was true for a lot of people. Elias looked at her, his eyes softening. Was there something making her feel alone? The question was like a knife to the deepest part of Clara. She had so much to say, but her throat was constricted. Yes, I just miss home sometimes. He nodded, not asking further. Homesickness is a common thing. But Clara knew. He was still observing her more than she thought. That evening, the wind began to pick up. The branches of the trees outside the porch gently brushed against each other, making a sound that was not too loud, but enough to make one think. Clara placed the teapot in front of Elias and Jacob, then sat down on the chair opposite. Jacob told a few small stories that happened in the meadow, while Elias just listened, occasionally adding a few comments. That family atmosphere made Clara feel both close and her heart tighten with unspoken secrets. After dinner, Jacob retired to his room early. Only Clara and Elias remained in the kitchen. The kerosene lamp cast a warm glow on the wooden tabletop, creating a small, warm spot in the cold outside. Elias pulled out a pair of old leather gloves and set them on the table. She might need them tomorrow. The land up north was frozen. Working barehanded would be painful. Clara touched the gloves. The leather was soft but strong, carrying the old scent of wood and sun. Thank you. A long moment passed. The only sound they could hear was the wind blowing against the door. Clara took a deep breath, knowing she had to say something, even if it was just a start. Mr. Elias, Elias looked up at her. Her voice trembled slightly. If one day I told you something you didn't expect, I was afraid you would be angry. He frowned, not annoyed, just strange, angry about what Clara bowed her head. For not speaking up sooner. Elias sat silent for a moment, his deep brown eyes studying Clara closely. If what you say is true, I won't be angry. I may be sad, but I won't be angry. One should only be angry when one is deceived by malice. I don't think you are that kind of person. Clara listened to every word like a person lost in the snow finding a bit of warmth. But Elias continued, his voice lower. The only thing that disappoints me is when someone chooses to remain silent, when the truth could save everything before it's too late. Clara clenched her fists at that. She understood, even without speaking. He seemed to be speaking to her heart. The wind outside was getting stronger. The windows were shaking slightly. Elias got up and added more wood to the fire. As the flames rose, his shadow on the wall was long and strong, like the shadow of an old tree in a storm. Clara watched him and felt one thing clearly: the day she would have to tell the truth was drawing near. She could not put it off any longer. Elias turned back, his voice low and steady. Clara, one can only stand when one does not carry too much weight on one's heart. When you are ready, I will listen, without judgment. Clara pursed her lips, her eyes stinging. I know. Neither of them said anything more. But the silence between them this time wasn't as tense as before. It was like the silence of two people standing side by side, on a cold night, sharing the same fire, without having to speak. When Clara returned to her room, she looked at the small mirror hanging beside the door. It reflected her face, tired, troubled, but also something else, a growing determination. She didn't know what would happen when the truth was told, but for the first time, she felt that maybe she wasn't as alone as before. The wind outside was still cold, but in Clara's heart, a small warmth was persistently burning. The next morning, gray clouds covered the sky, creating a chill that made Clara pull her scarf tighter around her neck. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, signaling that the day would not be easy. From the porch, she saw Elias refasten the horse's harness and Jacob load some packages into the wagon. Today is the first winter market of the year. It is the occasion when people from the surrounding areas bring their agricultural products, goods, woolen textiles, and all kinds of handmade goods to exchange. A rare, bustling day in the vast and lonely land. Elias looked at Clara as she walked down the steps. Are you coming with us? Let's go see how the town comes alive this time of year. Clara hesitated, but then nodded. Yes, I want to go. Elias handed her a thicker coat. She would need it. As the wagon rolled away from Holt Creek Ranch, Clara sat in the back, looking back at the shrinking warmth of the cabin. She wondered if today could be the day she told it all. But every time the thought surfaced, fear pulled her back, as if some invisible hand held her to the past. The road to Ash Ridge was cold and windy. Bare trees stood silently on either side of the road, and in the distance, the mountains seemed half swallowed by mist. The wagon crossed the wooden bridge over Holt Creek, the crunch of the tires reminding Clara of the evening she and Elias had stood together by the water. Every moment between them was filled with unspoken words. As the wagon approached town, Clara marveled at the colorful scene before her. Red, green, and yellow yarn hung from the eaves of the stalls. Baskets of apples, pumpkins, and yellow corn were stacked in stacks. The sounds of laughter, children running, and the jingling of horse bells mingled together in a familiar bustle. Elias tied the horse to the stake and turned to Clara. "If you're tired, go to the nearby cafe and rest. Jacob and I will take the goods to exchange first." Clara nodded, but she wanted to go with them a little longer to understand more about life in this small town. The three of them passed by the stalls. The people who saw Elias greeted them with friendly smiles, and most of them also turned curious eyes on Clara. Not unfriendly looks, but the natural curiosity of a newcomer. An old lady with a kind face called out, "Elias, long time no see. The girl who came with her is—" Elias turned to Clara. "This is Clara. She lives at the ranch with us." The old woman looked at Clara for a long time. "She is a good girl. I can tell by looking at her. Keep a good heart. It will help you get through the winter in this part of the country." Clara bowed her head in thanks. "I will remember your words." Simple words, but made her heart strangely warm. While Elias and Jacob were trading, Clara stopped by the old bookstall. She carefully turned the pages of the books, which had turned yellow with age. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out from behind her. "I thought I would see you here." Clara turned. It was Martha. She stood there, her face calm, her eyes sharp but not lacking the warmth familiar to Western women. Clara smiled slightly. "Hello, Mrs. Martha?" She studied her for a moment before asking, "Are you okay? You seem lost in thought lately." Clara put the book down, her hands clenching. "Yes, I'm fine." Martha crossed her arms. She knew that the most tiring thing wasn't the work. It was keeping something to yourself for too long. That made Clara choke. "Martha, if someone said something that would change things, do you think they should say it?" Martha answered slowly. "It was hard to say right from wrong, but I knew one thing. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only way to keep people from being weighed down by themselves. Telling it or not, the choice was yours, but hiding from it would not help anyone live in peace." Clara felt her eyes sting. "I understand." Martha placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. I saw more in her eyes than she knew. There was something she wanted to hold on to, and something she was afraid to lose. It was just, no one was whole when caught between the two. Clara bowed her head. Thank you." Martha said nothing more. She just nodded and left. At that moment, Clara realized that she could no longer carry her worries with her. Even though Elias did not know it, it seemed that everyone around her could sense the heaviness in her. When she returned to Elias and his father, Jacob handed her a brown scarf. She tried it on to see if it suited her. The salesman said the color suited people with sad eyes. Clara chuckled. "Are your eyes sad?" Jacob shrugged. "Not bad sadness. Sadness, like having something to think about." Elias looked at her, his deep eyes as if he wanted to read everything she was not saying. "Take it if you like. It is cold this season." Clara squeezed the scarf in her hand. "Thank you." By evening, the market began to thin out. The cold wind picked up faster. Elias decided to return before the fog thickened. On the way home, the wagon rolled through the clearings, sunlight glinting through the bare branches. Clara sat in the back, her hands clasped in her lap. She wanted to speak, to free herself, but she was afraid she would destroy this precious bit of peace. Elias's voice rang out, not loud, but loud enough for Clara to hear over the wind. "Clara, I've lived in this area all my life. I know when someone is struggling inside." Clara looked up. Elias. Elias didn't turn back. She didn't need to rush. But don't let fear cloud what you truly want. His words fell into Clara's heart like warm drops of water on dry soil. She looked at Elias's back, steady and calm, enough for a trembling person to find support. And for the first time in years, Clara felt like she was about to have the courage to face her fear. Not now, but soon. Very soon. Today in the crowded market had taught her one thing. No one can live comfortably while carrying a secret too big. It will find a way to escape, whether gently or violently. Clara knew which path she had to take, and she began to take her first steps. However shaky, it was dark by the time the wagon rolled back toward Holt Creek Ranch. The wind from the mountains was picking up, bringing a chill that made Clara huddle deeper into her coat. In the dim moonlight, the shadows of the trees crisscrossed like ancient sentinels standing watch over the fields. When the wagon stopped in front of the yard, Jacob jumped out first to open the gate. Elias reached out to help Clara, his hand strangely warm in the chill of the evening. Just that moment of light touch made Clara feel a faint vibration deep inside her. It was not a hasty feeling, but a peace, a feeling she had not felt in years. After dinner, Jacob went upstairs early, sunstroke from the day at the market. Clara took a basin of water out onto the porch to wash her hands, which were still covered with wool dust. The sky was gloomy, with dark clouds drifting low, as if the slightest touch could pull them from the sky. After a while, Elias stepped out onto the porch, slowly as always. He stood by the porch pillar, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Clara was silent, not daring to interrupt his train of thought. The silence between them was not heavy, but it allowed the wind to hear the breathing of the earth. Elias spoke first. "Are you tired today?" Clara wiped her hands on a napkin. "Not really. Just too much to think about." He nodded, as if he had seen it all along. A man with a preoccupation is always like that. You can see it without anyone telling you. Clara bent her face over the basin of water that sparkled in the moonlight. "Mr. Elias, have you ever done anything that you weren't sure you would be forgiven?" For Elias didn't answer right away. Just watched the sky for a long time, before speaking in a low, slow voice. "Yes. And I've learned that prolonged silence is also an option, but it comes at a price." Clara looked up. What was the price? Elias looked at her, his eyes as deep as a lake at night. It was losing the chance to let someone else into his world sooner. Clara felt every word sink into the skin under her collar. Sometimes people keep silent because they are afraid of losing what they have. Elias stepped a little closer. Sometimes people are afraid of losing themselves, not just others. Clara was stunned by his words. He had no idea what her secret was, but the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, made her feel as if he were speaking for her. After a long moment, Elias turned to go inside, but then he stopped and continued in a lower voice. "Clara, I never wish for anyone to say something they aren't ready to say, but I hope that when you have something to share, I'm the one you choose to tell it to." She heard the truth in his voice. No pressure, no demands, just the openness of a man who had lived through too many winters to understand that trust was sometimes the greatest gift of all. Clara watched his figure until the door closed. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay still on her small bed, listening to the wind blowing through the wooden window. Elias's words kept echoing in her head, mingling with the memories she had tried to bury for months. She remembered the old house in Missoula, the little wooden table by the window where she had written her first letter to Elias. She remembered her sister Lily putting her hand on her shoulder and telling her she had to go so they could both have a new life. She remembered the sad look in her eyes as she saw her off at the stagecoach stop, and Lily's final plea, "You must live, you must be happy, and never go back to the place that took everything from us." The memories suddenly flooded back, and Clara jumped up, as if the small room could not contain her emotions. She walked down the stairs softly, opened the back door and went out. The night air was so cold that her breath evaporated in wisps. Clara sat down on the back steps. She hugged her shoulders, trying to keep her soul from shaking with her body. A moment later, footsteps sounded from the door. Clara. She turned around, startled. Elias was standing there, holding his thick coat. I saw the light on in her room. I thought she had trouble sleeping." Clara did not reply. Elias came closer and gently placed his coat on her shoulders. The night wind was not good for one who thinks a lot. Clara clutched the hem of her dress, not understanding why those warm words made her throat tighten. "Mr. Elias, if a person is not who they say they are, if they pretend to be something, just because they are afraid, do you think that person is to blame?" Elias sat down next to her, keeping a small but not distant distance. "I think everyone has their own reasons for making difficult choices. Whether they are blameworthy or not depends on what they do afterward." Clara turned, her eyes tense with some unnamed emotion. He wasn't angry. Elias gently placed his hand on hers. "I only get angry when someone stays silent until it hurts. But if they tell the truth, even if it's late, I can't get angry." Clara bowed her head, tears falling on her cold palms. "There are things. I don't know where to begin." Elias looked at her for a long time. Start where it hurt the most, because that was usually the root. A gust of wind carried the scent of snow. Clara closed her eyes, her breathing trembling. It had been a long time since she had had anyone to lean on. She didn't know what to do. Elias replied in a low voice. She didn't learn to trust someone overnight. It was just a small step. Clara opened her eyes, and for the first time, she let her fear show. "If I tell you, will you promise to listen to the end?" Elias nodded. "I'll hear everything, when you're ready." A long silence passed between them. Neither of them said another word. But this silence was different. It wasn't heavy. It was like a warm woolen blanket, wrapped around the two of them under the cold sky. In that moment, Clara knew that the time to tell the truth was not far away. And she also knew that the fear inside her had begun to crack in small layers, like thin ice after a cold, windy night. The days that followed that cold evening passed quietly on the outside, but with turmoil on the inside. Clara worked diligently, carefully gathering dry wood, mending torn cloth, and measuring out rice for the chickens. But sometimes, in the midst of her familiar tasks, her hands would stop without explanation. She was like someone standing in front of a door that was just slightly opened, enough to see light behind, but not enough to step through. That morning, Clara was hanging out her freshly washed towels when Jacob came running from the stables, looking unusually cheerful. Elias wanted her to go home first. Someone had a letter for the ranch. Clara was startled. A letter for the ranch. Who sent it? Jacob shrugged. I don't know, but it looks like an invitation or something. Clara wiped her hands and followed Jacob into the main house. Elias was standing by the table, holding a pale yellow envelope. He looked at her with an unreadable gaze, but not cold, just deeper and quieter than usual. He handed her the envelope. It was addressed to her, Clara May Dawson. I thought you should read it. Clara stood still for a moment, as if someone had touched something hidden from her. But then she regained her composure and opened the envelope with slightly trembling fingers. The words inside immediately took her breath away. Harvest Haven Festival invitation. Dear families and residents of the Ash Ridge community. The end of the letter also listed the names of the special invitees, and her name was next to Elias and Jacob. Clara read it over and over again, not believing her eyes. I was invited with you two. Elias nodded. They already considered her a local. Every year there was a festival. Every family participated. Baking, singing, bonfires in the courtyard. They wanted her to come with us. Clara clutched the letter to her chest. But I've only been here recently, Jacob chimed in cheerfully. People in this part of the world didn't wait long to consider someone their own, as long as they saw you for who you were. Clara looked at Elias, her heart aching, though she didn't know what it was. This unexpected gift was both beautiful and terrifying, as if it was waiting for her to take a step closer to a future she didn't know if she was allowed to enter. Elias watched her hesitation, then spoke slowly. If she was uncomfortable, there was no need to force herself, but the festival would help her understand the land better, understand the people around her. She wouldn't have to go alone. Clara squeezed the letter one more time before replying softly. I'm just afraid I won't fit in. Elias stepped closer, close enough for his voice to be reassuring, She belonged where she felt safe, in Holt Creek Ranch. It had never been the same since she arrived. Clara's face heated up despite the cool morning air. She turned away to hide her embarrassment. "Well, I'll try. I'll go." Jacob cheered and ran to the door as if he had just heard that winter would end soon. Elias stood beside Clara. She had nothing to worry about. The festival didn't require much, just a genuine smile. Clara bent down. "Yes, let me see if I can keep that smile." A flash of sadness crossed Elias's eyes. She would find it again. When he left, Clara stood alone in the kitchen, where the morning light illuminated the dust motes floating in the air. She forced herself not to think about what was threatening to escape her lips, the truth about her age, about the lie, about the wounds she carried. But the more she tried not to think about it, the more her anxiety grew. The festival would be a gathering of the entire region. How could she take part in it when she carried a secret like a stone tied to her heart? That afternoon, Clara went out into the backyard to tend the winter vegetable beds. The ground was cold, but she liked the feel of her fingers touching the small roots struggling to survive the cold. They were like her, fragile, but still clinging to the ground, trying to survive. A moment later, Elias came to help, carrying a bucket of fertilizer. He said nothing, nor did he interrupt her thoughts. They worked side by side, listening only to the sound of the hoe hitting the ground and the wind blowing through the pines. Then in the evening, when the meal was over and Jacob had gone to bed, Clara took the kettle out onto the porch to make tea. Elias was sitting in the old wooden chair, his figure as still as the small mountain behind the house. Clara placed a cup of tea near him. He drank it to warm himself. It was much colder than last night. Elias took it and looked at her for a long time. "You have something to tell me, right?" The question made Clara's heart clench. How? How did you know? Elias smiled slightly, very small. No one had eyes like hers unless they were holding something important. Clara sat down in the chair next to him, her hands clasped in her lap. "I wanted to say something. I just couldn't find the courage." Elias did not urge. Courage is not always a big thing. Sometimes it is a small thing, like telling half a story, and then the other half the next day. Clara took a deep breath. What if I wasn't honest from the start? What if I did something wrong? Do I still deserve to be here? Elias put down his teacup, his voice slow and low. "Clara, people aren't judged by their mistakes. They're judged by how they handle them. Holt Creek doesn't take people because they're perfect. It keeps those who stand up." Clara felt her eyes sting. She wanted to tell the truth right now, but at the same time, Lily's image appeared in her mind like a warning. Her sister had been through too much. She couldn't let the past drag her down again. She said softly, "I'm afraid, when you know, you will be disappointed." Elias looked at her for a long time, his eyes devoid of judgment. "I was only disappointed when someone didn't believe they deserved a chance. As for you, I never thought otherwise." Clara turned away so that no one could see the tears that fell. "I promise. I will tell you. But please give me a little more time." Elias nodded. "I can wait. When you're ready." Clara stood up and walked into the house, her heart breaking a little more. Not from the pain, but from the light that was shining inside. Forcing her to face it, the lie could no longer stay in the dark. It was about to be told, and the upcoming festival will be where all paths meet, both past and present. The next morning opened with a silvery gray sky, as if the land were holding its breath, waiting for something. Clara woke earlier than usual. She stood at the window, looking out at the Holt Creek field, covered in a thin layer of frost. The frozen blades of grass shimmered like tiny silver threads in the first sunlight. A new day, but her heart was still filled with turmoil from last night's conversation. Elias had given her space to tell the truth, but that space made her realize she was standing on the most fragile line in her life. Clara went down to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. The wood fire crackled softly in the hearth, warming the kitchen. As she cooked, she thought about the upcoming festival. The whole neighborhood would be gathering, and it filled her with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, like standing at a crossroads. Jacob ran down, his eyes still sleepy but full of anticipation. "Clara, Martha and I are going to set up a cake stand. Come along." Clara scooped the dough into her hands. She would go. But she wasn't as good at baking as Martha. Jacob grinned. She said she was happy just having her there. Clara was about to reply when Elias walked in. He hung up his long coat and asked softly, "Did you sleep well?" Clara nodded, even though the truth was different. "Yes, it's fine." Elias looked at her briefly. "If you want to take a break today, Jacob and I can take care of the outside of the barn." Clara shook her head, forcing a soft smile. "I can do it. Work helps keep my mind off things." Elias said nothing more, but there was an understanding in his eyes that was difficult to put into words. After breakfast, the family began preparations for the festival. Jacob carried lanterns into the yard, hanging them one by one on the wire that ran along the fence. The lanterns were hand-cut paper lanterns, and when the sunlight shone through, they cast shimmering patches of light on the ground. Clara helped Elias sort through some of the items that would be brought to the ranch's display seeds, some woolen goods, and jars of homemade honey. As she sorted, Clara's hand came across a small wooden box among the pile. She opened it. Inside was the handkerchief she had given Elias when she first arrived at the ranch, a soft blue, the stitching clumsy. She was surprised he had kept it, carefully placing it in the box as if he didn't want to lose it. Elias passed by just then. "I kept it because it was the first dish she made here." Clara blushed slightly. "I thought he didn't notice." Elias smiled. "I notice more than you think." The words made Clara's heart tremble slightly, like a bird's wing touching the surface of a still lake. It was light, but enough to create ripples. At noon, Clara went down to Ash Ridge with Jacob to help Martha prepare ingredients for the bakery. The road to town was still cold, but not as heavy as the previous days. Perhaps it was the bustling preparations for the festival that had changed the atmosphere of the area. When she arrived at Martha's house, the smell of cinnamon and fresh flour wafted from the doorstep. Martha stood at the kitchen table, her sleeves rolled up, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun. As always. "You're here. Clara, today is a busy day." Clara smiled and rolled up her sleeves. "If there is anything I can do to help, just let me know." All afternoon, the three of them kneaded dough, shaped cookies, and sliced apples into the festival's signature pie. Clara was new to the process, but Martha insisted that she just go at her own pace. "No rush, no perfection," Martha asked suddenly over the sound of knives on the cutting board. "Clara," she looked more thoughtful than usual. "Was someone worrying her?" Clara paused. "No, not really. I just have something to say, and I don't know how." Martha studied her for a long moment before answering softly. There were some things that, if spoken, would free one. But there were also some things that, spoken, were not to relieve oneself, but to make others understand why one trembled. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. She was afraid that if she said it, things would never be the same again. Martha put her hands on the table, her voice low and steady as rock. "Do you want me to tell you the truth?" Clara nodded. "No one in this life lives forever with the fear of loss, because when they do, the first thing they lose is themselves." The words were like a light knife, not painful, but cutting through the thick layer of ice Clara had carried since leaving Missoula. Clara pursed her lips. She was afraid Mr. Elias would be disappointed. Martha chuckled. If Elias were that easily disappointed, the ranch wouldn't be standing. "As for you, I can see only one thing. You've changed this place. People here can feel it. Elias, too." Clara bowed her head, her hands covered in white powder. She wasn't as good as he thought. Martha narrowed her eyes. "Clara, no one is good enough to be in someone else's life from the start. They become good because they go through hard times together. That's all." Those words penetrated Clara's heart like the warmth of a fire spreading through the house. When the work was done, it was late afternoon. Jacob ran out into the yard excitedly. It had started to snow. Clara stepped out onto the porch. The first snowflakes of the season were falling softly, as if the sky were hesitating before sending winter down upon the land. On the way back to the ranch, snow covered Clara's hood and clung to her scarf, making her look like someone out of a sad but gentle fairy tale. When they arrived, Elias was waiting on the porch. He looked at her, then at the snow on her shoulders, as if memorizing every detail. He asked softly, "Are you okay?" Clara nodded. "Okay. Martha said she would teach me how to make the filling tomorrow." Elias nodded after hearing that. Good. This festival perhaps meant more to her than she thought. Clara sensed something behind those words, but didn't ask further. The two just stood there, watching the snow fall onto the yard, filling the space between them with peace, but also touching an unspeakable longing. Inside Clara, a voice, very small, very weak, but growing louder. It was time for her to face her truth. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to move on, really move on. The morning of Harvest Haven began with an unusually calm sky. The snow had stopped falling overnight, leaving a soft white blanket on every roof, every pine grove, and even the paths leading into town. When Clara opened the window, a cold wind rushed in, bringing with it a refreshing feeling, as if the land was changing clothes for the special day. She stood there for a long time before that scene. Though she didn't say anything, her heart was trembling slightly, like someone about to enter a crowded place after so many years of living in the shadows. Today's festival was more than just a gathering. To her, it was like a boundary. Once she crossed it, all the things she had hidden might no longer have a place to hide. When she came down to the kitchen, Elias was making coffee and Jacob was tying his old moccasins. They were dressed more formally than usual. Elias was wearing a dark brown trench coat, and Jacob was wearing the plaid shirt Clara had mended for him last week. Elias looked at her, his eyes softening visibly. Was she ready? Clara nodded slightly. Yes. I think so, Jacob exclaimed. She looked like a real carnival girl, just like Clara in the painting. Clara laughed softly, though her laughter didn't reach her heart. She just hoped she hadn't disappointed anyone. Elias walked over and adjusted her scarf. Just be yourself. Just one simple sentence, but it made Clara's breath stop. The warmth from his voice seemed to penetrate the cold air to touch her softest fear. The three of them piled into the wagon and headed toward Ash Ridge. The drive was more beautiful than usual this morning. The early morning sunlight made the snow sparkle like glitter. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and cold earth, familiar yet comforting to Clara. As the wagon approached town, Clara heard laughter and fiddle music coming from the main square. Ash Ridge had never been more bustling. Lanterns were hanging high, and red and yellow ribbons were strung across the wooden houses. People were gathered in groups, chatting and setting up booths. Clara got out of the car and looked around, a mixture of shock and excitement. Jacob ran to the children's area where the quoits were being set up. Elias took Clara to Martha's bakery. Martha was waiting, her hands on her hips, her face full of excitement. Ah, you're here. I thought you'd be late because you were hesitant. Clara smiled. I'm just a little nervous. Martha took Clara's hand and pulled her to stand beside her. Stand here with me. When you are busy working, your heart will be less anxious. Elias stood behind her, nodding slightly at Clara. If you need anything, just call. I'll be nearby. Clara watched as Elias left. His footsteps were steady on the snow-covered ground, blending in with the crowd as if he had belonged here since the very beginning. A man like him, standing in the middle of a crowd, still radiated a peace that made others want to approach him. Martha's voice brought Clara back to the present. Come, help me arrange the cakes on the tray. Clara and Martha placed each apple pie on the long wooden table. The scent of cinnamon, butter, and baked apples wafted through the cold air, warming the entire festival area. As more and more people arrived, Clara smiled at each one, trying not to let the slight awkwardness that was rising in her heart show. After a while, people started to recognize her. Was she the girl who lived at Holt Creek Ranch with Elias and Jacob? I heard she was a hard worker. She seemed nice. Elias had found someone good. Clara listened to each compliment, and her heart gradually calmed down. Those words were like small pebbles thrown into the lake inside her, creating intertwining waves. They saw her as a native of this land, but if they knew the truth, would they still keep that friendly look? A middle-aged woman approached the stall, looking Clara up and down before speaking. Daughter, I heard Elias mention you a couple of times. He doesn't talk about anyone much. And when he does, his voice is different. Clara paused. Different. How? The woman smiled gently. Her voice began to open her heart. Clara stood still. Her hands were frozen around the embroidered tablecloth on the table. The words were like a needle to the softest part of her. She felt it every evening they sat together on the porch. But hearing it said by someone else made it real. Closer. Harder to avoid. The festivities continued, growing more and more boisterous. Fiddles blared and cowboy boots pounded the ground, creating a strong rhythm. Children ran through the crowd, and baskets of red apples filled wooden tables. By afternoon, the sky was a pale orange. Clara had just given a cake to a little girl when Jacob ran up. "Clara, they're going to have a bonfire. Mr. Elias wants you." Clara thanked Martha and left the stall. When she arrived, she found Elias standing next to a large pile of firewood in the middle of the square. The fire had started, and its light crackled, illuminating the faces of the people standing around. When he saw her, his gaze softened like a lake after the rain. "Good. She's here." Clara stood next to Elias, her breath mingling with the evening breeze. She had never been to a festival like this before. Elias looked at the blazing fire. It was a time to give thanks for the harvest, and also for those who had passed through their lives for another year. Clara blinked. "You mean, thank those who stayed." Elias turned to look at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, making them shine brighter than usual. "Yes." That moment made Clara shiver slightly. Elias, if someone wasn't sure they could stay, what did he think they should do? Elias took a deep breath. They should be honest, because sometimes the truth doesn't take anything away. It just brings them closer together. His words were like a key placed in her hand, warm and firm. Clara wanted to say it right away. Wanted to say I lied about my age right there. But her throat was constricted, as if she were stuck between two worlds. As she was still struggling, a voice suddenly rang out from behind. "Clara, is that Clara Mae Dawson?" She turned. The crowd parted. A man with snow on his coat came toward her. The sight of his face made Clara freeze. She took a step back without feeling her feet. Elias looked at the two, his eyes darkening like the sky was about to rain. She knew this person. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and surprise. "Clara, is it true? I thought I would never see you again." At that moment, Clara's whole body swayed, because she never expected the past to come back to her on the day she was about to tell the truth. And the person in front of her was none other than the person who knew the secret she feared the most. The campfire was burning brightly, just like Clara's heart was beating wildly in her chest. Each spark emitted a small sound, echoing in the cold air of the late autumn afternoon. But all those sounds seemed to disappear when the man stood in front of her, just a few steps away. He looked at her as if he had come hundreds of miles to find something long lost. His eyes were bloodshot, like someone who hadn't slept in many nights. His coat was covered with frost. Part of Clara wanted to back away, to hide in the shadows behind Elias, but another part knew this couldn't be hidden any longer. Clara clenched her fists, trying to keep her breathing steady. Why were you here?" The man looked at her, his voice hoarse. "I heard about a girl who had run away from Philadelphia. I went looking for you. Clara, you disappeared without a word. And I feared the worst." Elias stood beside Clara, his eyes serious but not cold. He looked at the other man with the calmness of someone who had seen many storms. Who was he? Why did he recognize her? The man took a deep breath and replied, "I'm Samuel Reeves. I knew her family. Was close to her father." The name brought Clara to the cold ground. Samuel Reeves. The only man left after that fateful day that shattered everything in her life. The man who witnessed the loss of her family, and the only one who knew the reason why Clara had to leave. People around began to whisper. The campfire continued to burn, its light illuminating Clara's face, highlighting every tense line, every glistening drop of dew on her eyelids. Clara took a step back, keeping her distance. "Mr. Samuel, I've tried to forget it all." Samuel softened his voice. "Clara, your father sent me one last letter before he died. He wanted me to find you if I could. He was worried you would run away from the city without anyone by your side." Clara shivered slightly. "What?" What did he say? Samuel sighed, as if what he was about to say hurt him too. He said there was too much going on for you to bear alone. Your mother's death, the cruel gossip, the people who wanted to control your life. He knew you were afraid of the future, and he wanted you to know. You didn't have to run. Clara looked down. The snow beneath her feet glittered in the firelight, but her heart felt like it was sinking into a bottomless darkness. I ran, because everything was too heavy. I couldn't bear another day. Clara's voice was as small as the wind through the old door, and she lied on the way, about her name, about her age, about everything. She just wanted to start over. Every word Clara had tried to keep hidden was dragged out before Elias. He said nothing, but he looked at her intently, without judgment, without haste. There was only a patient silence, like a flat plane waiting for a storm to pass. Samuel looked at Elias. I hear he's been good to you, but if you need to go back to Philadelphia, we can go together. I'll take care of you. You still have a home, and... Clara shook her head so hard her hair came loose from its pins. Philadelphia was no longer my home. I left everything there. I didn't want to go back. Elias stepped forward, standing between Clara and Samuel, not blocking her view, but enough to make Clara feel protected. She had a place to live, and we never forced her into anything. Samuel looked at Elias for a long time and then asked Clara, So why did you disappear? Why did you run away from everything? You should have let someone help you. Clara was silent. Her breathing became heavy. I hid because I carried my mistakes with me. Elias tilted his head, his eyes still soft. You can tell me. Clara's voice cracked like a pebble thrown into a pond. I'm not 28, like I said. I'm 22. I know you need someone mature. I know I'm not the right choice. But I need a place to live. Samuel placed his hand on Clara's shoulder, but she gently moved away. Clara, it's just a number, Elias asked softly. Do you think that truth will make me change my view of you? Clara turned to Elias. What about leaving the past behind? Leaving my father behind? Leaving the people who suffered because of me? I can't face anyone anymore, Samuel said softly. I didn't leave my father. I only left the pain. Remember that. In that moment, Clara stood between two men who represented two worlds in her life. A world of memories that left her breathless. A world of the present, where she had just come to know warmth and peace, and she had to choose. Clara looked at Elias for a long time. Would he be angry with her for lying to him about his age? Elias placed a hand lightly on Clara's arm. I was angry if she lied because she despised me, but she lied because she was afraid, because of loss, because of desperation, and that I understood. Clara burst into tears without stopping. You didn't push me away. Elias took a deep breath. I didn't want anyone to leave Holt Creek if they were looking for a place to heal. The tension in Clara seemed to ease little by little. It was as if someone had opened a door to let the first morning light into a room that had long been locked. Samuel said softly, If you have found your place, I will not force you. Clara wiped away her tears. I want to stay, even though things are still hard. But I want to stay. Elias didn't smile, but his gaze was so warm that Clara felt like she was being wrapped in a soft woolen blanket. Then stay. The fire before them flared up in its light. Clara saw clearly that the path she had been running from was not as dark as she had thought. Now it opened up to another path, brighter, more peaceful, but also more challenging. And for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of it. That evening, the campfire slowly dwindled to a few smoldering embers, like Clara's heart, after a long and turbulent day. Samuel left the festival before it was completely dark. He left Clara with a hesitant hug and a promise not to bother her if she chose her own path. As he walked down the snow-covered path, his shadow stretched across the white, slowly but firmly, like a piece of an old memory being slowly laid down. Clara watched until the only sound left in the festival was the wind and the voices of the people. The cold air crept up her arms, but strangely, it did not make her flinch. Perhaps it was because Elias was beside her, standing still like an ancient tree in the wilderness, a solid support she never knew she could find. Elias touched her elbow lightly. Are you okay?" Clara let out a long, slow, heavy breath, as if she had been holding it in for years. "I think I'm better than before." He nodded. Tonight had been difficult for her, but she faced it. That was what strong people do. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but no longer trembling. "I was just afraid. I would bother you. I was afraid you would find me too complicated." Elias looked down into the dying fire. Everyone who lives long enough comes with their own complexities. What matters is who has the courage to walk with whom to the end. His words were slow, but they reached the deepest part of Clara's heart. There was no flowery language, just a simple, honest voice. That made her feel her heart open up a little more. The fiddle began again, soft and sad as an old dream. People began to dance around the fire, arms linked, dark coats swirling in the wind. Children laughed in the distance. Adults exchanged cups of hot cocoa. The whole space was filled with an indescribable warmth. Jacob ran up, his face flushed with cold and joy. "Clara, they're asking everyone to dance. Dance with Mr. Elias." Clara laughed, bending down to stroke Jacob's hair. "She couldn't dance," Elias said softly. "No one is born knowing." He held out his hand. "Are you coming?" Clara's throat tightened at that moment, not from fear, but from excitement. She looked at that hand, rough, strong, but strangely warm, a hand that had suffered so much, but still knew how to reach out at the right moment. Clara put her hand in his. They stepped closer to the fire, joining the swirling crowd. Clara's steps were stiff and awkward at first, but Elias held her gently by the shoulders, guiding her step by step, slowly, breathing deeply, letting the music guide her. Clara watched her leather boots move across the compacted snow. Each step seemed to leave behind a trace of anxiety. Gradually, she raised her face. The firelight reflected off Elias's face, revealing the lines etched by the years. His voice was deep and warm. "She had come a long way to be standing here tonight," Clara replied, her voice small but steady. "And I don't regret it." They turned slowly in a circle. Even though there was laughter and chatter around them, Clara felt as if the world was all theirs. A part of her, a part that had been hiding in the dark for so many years, was finally coming out. After the music, they separated from the crowd. Elias led her to a wooden fence where the entire festival could be seen from afar. The lights on the small pine trees twinkled like a ribbon of stars. Clara spoke first. "Mr. Elias, can I ask you something?" He turned. She asked. Clara gathered her courage. "If I told you I wanted to stay at Holt Creek, not just because it was safe, but because I wanted to be with you and Jacob, would you mind?" Elias was silent for a moment. The wind blew, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. He placed his hands on the wooden railing and looked out into the distance. "I had lived alone for a long time. I had gotten used to the silence. I had gotten used to the sound of the wind more than the sound of people. But since she had arrived, that quiet house had the sound of a door opening, the smell of bread, the evening conversation, and Jacob's laughter." He turned back to look at her, his eyes gentle and deep like the surface of a western lake after dawn. "So, if you want to stay for us, I don't mind. I'm grateful." Clara tightened her grip on her scarf. "I'm not perfect." Elias smiled, a quiet but beautiful smile. "No one in this land is perfect. We just try to live so as not to miss out on the things worth cherishing." Clara felt her heart warm with each beat. "So, can I stay?" Elias tilted his head slightly. "She was still standing next to me, and I didn't want her to go anywhere." At that moment, Clara felt as if the snow falling in her heart had melted. No longer heavy, no longer cold, only a relief so deep that it made her eyes sting. A farmer passed by and shouted, "You two are standing too far away. The view is ruined. The fire is raging." Elias smiled. "Let's go home. Jacob is looking for you." Clara nodded and followed him back to the festival. The music played again, gently as a farewell to the old season and welcoming the new. In the light of the campfire, Clara saw herself reflected in Elias's eyes. No longer the girl running from the past, no longer the one living on fear, but someone walking this vast land with her own 2 feet. A land has chosen her, and a heart is opening to welcome her. That night, as the fire died down and the cleanup began, Clara stood beside Elias and Jacob, looking up at the starry sky of the American West. The wind blew gently against her face, carrying with it a whisper of rebirth. In that moment, Clara knew one thing for sure. She would no longer run. She would live. She would love. And she would let the moments define her life, not the numbers, the fears, or the rumors that had held her down. And in Holt Creek, with Elias and Jacob, she found what many would call a miracle. But for Clara, it was simply something ordinary and incredibly important. A place to start over, an arm to lean on, a love not measured by age, but by moments of knowing you are seen, understood, and chosen. Clara and Elias' story reminds us that age, pain, and the past are never the end. We all have parts of our lives that we want to hide. But when we are brave enough to open our hearts, we will see that the cracks can also become places for light to shine through. No matter how old we are, we still have the right to love, to start over, to live our own lives without being defined by mistakes or judgment. What matters is not the years that have passed, but the moments we dare to live authentically and dare to choose what brings peace to our souls. This story hopes to touch those who have been hurt, to let them know that there is always a place for them, and there are still hearts warm enough to welcome them back. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this humane story.